Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Andrew Zwerneman, president of Cana Academy. For 40 years, Andrew has taught and consulted in secondary schools and emphasized classic humanities. For 19 years, he headed schools, 2 at the public charter school, Tempe Preparatory Academy in Tempe, Arizona, 17 at Trinity School in Meadowview and Falls Church, Virginia. He's the founder and owner of the Academy Project, which wrote the original curricula and trained facilities for Thomas McLaren School in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and Trinity Academy in Portland, Oregon. He has degrees from the University of Notre Dame and St. John's University. He is the author of History Forgotten and Remembered, published in 2020, and The Life We Have Together, A Case for Humane Studies, A Vision for Renewal, published in 2022. Andrew, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I'm just really honored to join you, and I'm so encouraged by your work, and I'm delighted too with the opportunity we get to talk about things of mutual interest today.
That's so true, and I really enjoyed getting to meet you. I've followed your work by writing and reputation for years, and I was so glad that you were willing to come join us at the Thales conference earlier this year. And really enjoyed your presentation about history. I know we'll get into that here in a minute. Before we get to history, I'd love it if you could start us off. Tell us a bit about Cana Academy. What is it? How did you start it? What place does it fill in the classical renewal movement?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I was a teacher from 1983 to 2016, and sometimes headmaster, curricular architect, a number of things, wore a number of different hats. I was 56 in 2015, and I thought I had running legs for one more serious creative push, and I prayed hard about it for several months, and I reached out to potential allies, and this concept came to germinated and then came to fruition that we'd have an academy for teachers. And I had worked in academies, of course, for students for years and years, but I had several allies, including a couple of fellow master teachers, people with almost as much experience or more as I had. We got together and said, why don't we try to share our 100-plus years of experience with as many humanities teachers as possible, thereby impacting as many humanities students as we can. And we thought, what are our fields of expertise? We're all three of us were, had multiple decades, each of us, running seminars. And we knew a lot about the seminar method. We also had taught writing. We taught history, poetry. We had trained students in how to look at a work of art. And I had trained headmasters. I had mentored a lot of teachers. I traveled the country working inside and out of Catholic, evangelical, ecumenical, public charter, schools of all kinds. And I thought, okay, let's do that. And we found some great support and people who, and everyone, and I did a survey. I reached out to a lot of people nationally, and people said, oh yeah, this would be great. You have a kind of expertise, you and your team, that the classical education movement needs. And that's what we decided to do. So we've created a website. We have literally hundreds of articles on how to teach. We have lots of broadcasts, podcasts, interviews, etc. And then we've created more than 60 guides on classical works of imaginative and expository literature, everything a teacher would need to get going and lead a really great discussion with the students about that classic text. So that's what we do. We travel the country training people in person. We have people at our headquarters in Falls Church, Virginia. And then we are, trying to build this whole thing to scale by having loads of resources online.
That's pretty fantastic. I was recently rereading David Hicks' book, Norms and Nobility, and I was struck by his comment in the introduction, because he wrote that first in 1980, if I understand this correctly, but then the current edition he came back in 1990 and wrote a new introduction after 10 years. And he talks there about one thing he would change if he were writing it again was to focus a lot more on reforming teachers rather than on curriculum. That struck me as really significant, because I think so often we think about education as a matter of getting the curriculum right, getting the policies right, but we ignore the teachers who are there in the classroom. And when we don't equip those teachers with what the tools they need to teach, or the really the framework from which to teach, we really do them a disservice. And they're the ones doing the actual work of teaching and helping students to learn. And so it seems to me that you're about a great project with equipping teachers in order to really bring about classical education.
Thanks a lot. We're so blessed to be able to do this work. I really like Hicks's book, and I think it's one of the important books that ought to be on the shelf of any classical school leader or teacher. One thing that I have worked hard on, and it's very germane to the language of normativity, is I worked very hard on trying to help teachers distinguish between our responsibilities in training students regarding what is, as in philosophy, what we should do, as in moral philosophy, and then how we should feel. And that's one that often throws people off, but following especially in the footsteps of Sir Roger Scruton, whose birthday is today, by the way, he had a lot to say, and I've tried to train a lot of teachers to think this way, that we don't read fiction, we don't look at painting, we don't listen to music the way we practice moral action. So, you can't become courageous by reading about someone courageous or listening to a song about someone courageous or looking at a painting of someone courageous. You become courageous, as Aristotle teaches, and Aquinas confirms this, by doing courageous things time and time and time again. I think within the movement, sometimes there's confusion about how to take on the fine arts. And it's very easy to slip into moralizing under the impulse, the right impulse, that everything's normative. But the best thing we should do in terms of training students, in terms of intellectual excellence, is to make those important distinctions between, say, moral philosophy and aesthetics. Under moral philosophy, we examine what humans do, human behavior, what we ought to do. And under aesthetics, we examine what humans make. And we do bring right judgments to bear on those works of art. So we respond to certain works. We go, no, that's violent to the sensibilities, or that's banal. And by those kind of works, we don't see more of reality. We see less of it. And then we try to teach our students to look at things that will suit the dignity of their humanity, will give us shared experiences of sympathy and other kinds of right feelings. Anyway, I'm glad you brought that up. It's on my mind a lot. And I'm very grateful for David Hicks's contribution there, and it's made me think harder about how to make those distinctions regarding normativity.
Well, since you brought up Sir Roger, I'll just in case any of our listeners are curious, I'll direct them to one of the previous episodes in season 6, which has not yet dropped as we're recording this, but it's coming soon, where I interviewed Ferenc Horcher, a biographer of Sir Roger Scruton. I love Sir Roger's work, and I'm so glad you reminded me it's his birthday. So I was very grateful for him that he entered into eternity. Sad for us, but it's great for him. And we certainly benefit a lot from his work. Now, as we transition over to history, maybe hopefully this is not too rough of a segue, but I'm reminded of your previous comments reminded me of Philip Sidney's argument that history is not nearly as noble as literature, in the sense that literature is studying what ought to be. He's following Aristotle in that sense. But history is not really studying what ought to be. Instead, history is really studying what is and what has been. And as such, it has this focus on the actual events of human nature and human existence and human civilization. So with that as a thought, let's get into a conversation about history. Mr. Zwerneman, what role do you see history playing, particularly in the classical classroom? And is there a particular way you think that classical educators should or should not approach the study of history?
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate for the study of history. You brought up Aristotle, and it's interesting that Aristotle had very little to say about history. In the Poetics, he says that history has to do with what happened. Elsewhere, he works up material that historians would work up. For example, in his political science, he works up about 156 constitutions and categorizes them, forms a hierarchy between best and to worst. But he never writes about history as an art or a science, art being something like poetry or rhetoric, and a science course being politics or biology and zoology. Very interesting. It didn't develop that, and it's also interesting that he had, in ancient Athens, everyone knew about Herodotus and Thucydides. So it wasn't that there weren't good examples of histories, and two histories, by the way, that have lasted. They've endured all these years. They're still classics with us. I think the study of history becomes even more important under certain historical events. I think it's right to say that the Hebrew people were the first people to live under history. That is, the events of Exodus became absolutely formative and central to their life. You look at what happened in the entry into Israel with the 12 tribes, and it didn't happen immediately, but their account of who they are, having been liberated from slavery in Egypt, crossing through the sea, and then crossing through, traveling in the desert for 40 years, taking Israel, the taking, of southern Israel eventually, and Jerusalem becoming such a central place, and the temple being the center of Israel. Think about the Passover meal. These are all of great historical significance to our Hebrew forebears, and the role of history takes on an even greater acceleration with the Christian claim to God becoming incarnate and becoming one of us. And so, and even in the Christian liturgy, there's a line that says, Christ says, "Do this in memory of me." So living in recollection of the past, in a sense, was forged most importantly, not exclusively, but most importantly by our Jewish and Christian forebears. And it became a regular habit of mind, a habit of culture, a way of interpreting our existence in Western civilization that I think that the Greeks could not have understood. And I don't blame them for that. It's just simply that, Revelation brought with it impacts on how we think about history that couldn't have been accessed by our Greek forebears, our philosophical forebears. So I think history is extremely important. Now, down to the kind of the nuts and bolts or down the weeds of it, Wilford McClay has a great line in his book, The Land of Hope, which is a wonderful narrative of American history. He says, we really can't live without history. That is, without a recollection of the past, we're dumb. That is, we're mute. We don't have language by which to speak about who we are as a society, who we are as humans. Practically, we need the examples of the past to make good decisions, good judgments. Collectively, and Roger Scruton has a lot to say about this, history collects for us the loves and the knowledge that allow us, no matter how diverse we are, and America's the most diverse country in the world, it allows us to live together. It gives us common ways of thinking, common ways of speaking, common laws, manners, customs, religious practice, and so forth. So I think the study of history is absolutely central to a humanities education by which one learns about what it means to be a human. History is the study of change in society, and you can't understand society unless you study those changes, and you can't understand what it means to be human unless you understand society in the past.
That is such an interesting set of reflections. I want to go back to that line you just mentioned about history allows us to live together, because it seems to me that at least in the last 10 years or so, the study of history has become increasingly a divisive topic. I know it can be a little, it can sometimes be an opportunity to launch historians onto a rant. So I hope this is not a temptation to you. But I mean, things like either the Black Lives Matter movement or the 1619 Project, or even to some extent the sort of the response in title, at least. Hillsdale has put together they have a great American history curriculum, but I'm pretty sure that the title of it was put together in response to the 1619 Project. Theirs is the 1776 curriculum. They wanted something similar to be a counter. Could you speak a bit more about the way that history allows us to live together when we approach it a certain way? How does that ground us maybe sort of how does that give us a sense of unity in the midst of this diversity that you're describing?
Oh, that's a great question. I propose an approach to history that's really adopting the language of our liberal tradition. And I don't mean by that classical liberalism. I mean by that a liberal education, where the goal of an education is to be free, and principally intellectually free. Free from what? Free from ignorance, free from unexamined opinion, free from ideology, and free to converse with each other. One of the greatest strengths of Western civilization is our longstanding habit of self-criticism. We need to be able to look at things and say, this is true. Oh, well, this account is actually more true. We need to re-examine our presuppositions and so forth. The first habit of mind that a student of history should adopt is to be observational. As we look at the past, because the past is different, and we follow historians by looking at past events and trying to put them together as thoroughly as we can, leaving nothing out. And you don't want to reduce the past to something less than what it is. One of the toxic forces today is to take the past and reduce it to less than what it is. The partner to observation is sympathy. And by sympathy, I mean two things. First of all, the most common meaning of sympathy is to suffer with someone else. All humans suffer. It's part of our condition. You could say, Flannery O'Connor says the most fundamental feature of our condition is our poverty. In other words, we all lack something. We need one another. We need God. We need society. Okay. But we all suffer. And part of what we do in studying history is we study the suffering of others. Some suffering is universal. We all face death. And so one of the things we want to study is, how do people face death courageously? Either, laying down their lives as parents, as soldiers, as statesmen, even in things like art. Artists work so diligently to embed their judgments in their works of art, and they turn around and they free us by allowing us to see what they see. Right? And this is a very generous gift. So we're all, in a sense, we're all moving with each other and making up for each other's wants. The second meaning of sympathy is more sweeping or encompassing. To be sympathetic is to have a natural affinity for all things human. And David McCullough has a great line about history. He says, history is a drama. The typical narrative history, and rightly, focuses on politics because, in a sense, it's the biggest umbrella that captures what happens within a society's life. But history is about everything. It's about the rise of a great musician. It's about a group of workers forging something new, or perhaps advocating for a better working condition within a corporation. It's about men and women having to endure the Dust Bowl or the Depression or wartime poverty, and all these kinds of things. So he looks at history as a drama. He says, it's kind of all-encompassing. So in order to study history, then, we need to look at it seriously, see it in its pastness, and not see it, as present, writ, small. We need to also be diligent and careful and detailed so that we don't reduce it to less than what it is. And then we also need to be sympathetic. That is, all of us have inherited life from those who came before us. That's just a fact. And some of that inheritance is at the cost, terrible cost, of lives. And some lives are lost because they willingly join the military and they lay down their lives for others. Some lives are lost because they've been coerced and suppressed and persecuted. I think a good representative, two good representatives for how to think about the past are Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. In the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln reached back to the founding and said, 7 years ago, and he didn't talk about self-evident truths. He talked about propositions. Now, self-evident truths are like axioms. They don't need to be proven. But to his mind, the whole claim to American liberty had to be proven. How? By freeing the slave, by defeating the Confederacy, and by freeing the slaver. As we need to, and then And then later on, he would talk about, moving ahead in charity with malice toward none. So these things had to happen if government for and by the people was to be proven true. And a lot was at stake, and it could have broken the other way. I mean, we could have stayed divided, we could have extended the war and so forth. But he was thinking in terms of the past in order to illuminate the present. He was also thinking that the decisions we make today here in the 1860s are decisions that bear directly on the past. That is, we're tied to those who are no longer with us. Nobody in his audience was old enough to remember the founding fathers. And yet the founding was still forceful enough to bear on his understanding and their sensibilities. 100 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. would invoke Lincoln and the founding. And in spite of the fact that some of the principal founders, you think of all the Virginians, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, George Mason, they were all slaveholders, and yet they were the most articulate practitioners or writers about American liberty, but they were slaveholders. And King did not dismiss them for their articulation of liberty. He said, what we had to do is make that articulation of liberty, as Lincoln did in 1863, come to fruition for those who are still wanting for liberty. See, that's an historical way to think about the difficult situation that segregation foisted on American blacks and others, by the way. But that was a great way to think, and that's one of the. If we follow those two examples, I think that we can see, that's the way to allow history to free us to see what we ought to see. That is, we're actually more free. Our minds are more liberated if we see the past in its pastness, and we allow it to inform the present. In turn, we allow the present decision to live by the truth of the past bear directly on how we hold our forebears. So, as Edmund Burke says, we're a community of the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. And history itself is a concept of unity. It's how we get our arms. It's like nature and being. It's how we get our arms around the whole of things. In this case, would be the past, the present, and the future.
That is a beautiful vision, and I'm so glad you brought Burke into it. As you were describing I wrote that line down, the pastness of the past. We don't want to reduce that down to something much less than it is. I'm reminded of Herbert Butterfield's lovely little book, The Whig Interpretation of History. I read that in college, and I came away from my history major convinced that part of what we're trying to do in historical study is get into the mindset of the actors in a past moment. And we can never do that perfectly, but we're always trying to understand what exactly motivated them to make the choices that they did and why they sought to do what they did. And in some cases, they do terrible things. There are just as many villains as there are heroes in historical moments. But in each case, they see their actions as worthwhile. And it belongs to us to try and understand them. And I love that term sympathy, that we develop sympathy for the past actors, and that we then we become to better understand ourselves, even as we are able to move imaginatively to understand these actors in the past.
Yes, that's beautifully said. Yeah. So our sympathies grow, and they become shared sympathy, shared feeling, shared experiences. And by sharing in what we ought to share, we have a better crack at living together. So if we go back to the premise of your question, the 1619 Project, BLM, DEI, these kind of things kind of point to and underscore great division in America. How can we be a diverse society with slavery and segregation in our past? And I think Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Lincoln point to ways moving forward. They also give credence to Wilford McClay's claim that we can't move forward, we can't live together unless we have the past to inform us. But we do have to be sympathetic. Just like we look at a work of art and you say take a painting like the Pieta, or a sculpture like the Pieta by Michelangelo, or a painting like the Tragedy by Picasso. Each painting has subject matter that moves us toward the subject. There's the arrangement of the sculpture, the arrangement of the painting, move us to sympathy for Mary and her son in the one case, and toward the little families in the tragedy by Picasso. In the second work of art, we don't know much about what happened. We just know something terrible has happened, and the color, the proximity of the subjects, the poverty of the subjects, all these things, and the way they comport themselves physically with their head down, their arms across their chest. They can't look at each other. They're in such pain. We're moved toward them in sympathy. And by sharing either in front of the Pieta or in front of the tragedy, we have something in common. All of us, students, teachers, people of all stripes and backgrounds, can share something deeply human. Same thing happens with history. We look at the past and its pastness, and there are things that we should learn from the past, which gives us common language, common feeling, and in turn, I think, gives us common hope.
Well, I think so, and perhaps it's that common hope that is one of the reasons that history plays such a big part of classical education. I want to ask you a version of a question that came up during your talk from one of the teachers in the audience. What is the balance that a good history teacher should try to strike between didactic instruction and primary source encounter? To what extent does the teacher sort of need to directly tell students, this is the point of this historical study, versus kind of set up the moment for the student to realize that through some sort of primary source that they're studying?
Yeah, that's a great question. When a really good biology teacher had introduced the students to human anatomy, he can accomplish that by a lecture and maybe a chart, But there's something that happens for the student of biology when the student dissects, say, a fetal pig. The pigs on the outside don't look a lot like us, but on the inside, the arrangement of their anatomy is a lot like human anatomy. So to actually work through the arrangement of the organs and the skeletal structure of a fetal pig, a student sees what a student could not see otherwise. Like, didactic instruction is really helpful, and a good biology teacher has a lot of knowledge to share with students. But the experience of working through the anatomy of a fetal pig, students can't. Our students can't work through cadavers, right? Only medical students get to do that. But they certainly can work through a pig, and the pig anatomy is really helpful to get them to see what they need to see. History students can really benefit from good lectures, and a really good history teacher is a very good storyteller. At the same time, the habit of history as a habit of mind needs to be a habit developed inductively, not just deductively. So a lecture will kind of lay out what a student ought to learn, and then the student applies what he's learned through the lecture, and that's kind of deductive learning. But inductive learning works through the things that a historian works through. So you give your students, for example, a map of England and France and the English Channel, and you ask them, okay, what do you see geographically? And it might take them a while, but eventually they see that, of course, the countries have a very tight proximity, and it's not that hard to travel over the English Channel. And then you show them a military map of William the Conqueror's invasion of England in 1066, and you realize, oh yeah, the proximity actually facilitated invasion. And then you go to the 100 Years' War, and you make your way through 8 centuries of wars between England and France, and you realize, the geographic foundation for their relationship, sometimes peaceful, sometimes at war, made a big difference. The last time that the proximity between France and England was significant militarily was on D-Day in 1944. And then you show them a map of that, and they go, oh, okay. And so they're working through maps the way, and you give them first just a topographic map, and then you give them a military map or a political map and so forth. You do something similar with data. Let's say you show them a data chart of migration of blacks from the South to the North in the 20th century. And you see that there's certain spikes, for example, in the 1920s, had largely to do with Jim Crow. And then you see another really big spike in the 1940s. It had largely to do with the fact that prior to World War II, for the most part, blacks were kept out of factories. So a lot of them moved north to take factory jobs because now the factory owners and the federal government and the state governments realize, okay, we're not going to be able to maintain our factories in wartime unless we, break down the racial barriers. So now, before you tell the students that, you give them the data, and knowing that they've already studied 20th century American history, you ask them to try to piece together an account of it. You say, put your detective hats on and try to get to motivation, find out why there were these big spikes and migration. Another thing that we give them are narratives, individual narratives and group narratives. Let's say you could give a really good lecture on the experience of slaves, but a more inductive way to get to that is to go to the Library of Congress and let the students listen to interviews that were recorded at the turn of the last century, recordings of former slaves talking about their experiences. And then let those stories accrue in the minds of these young historians, and they put their own account together. And it might be just as good as a teacher's lecture on that. A final example would be what historians call structural analyses. That is, you can learn a lot about the history of society by taking a particular structure and running through its chronology. For example, you put your finger on Marbury versus Madison, put your other finger on Brown versus Board of Education, and you can learn a lot about the history of judicial review in America. You could do something similar. You put your finger on Bismarck in 1871, the first head of government in the newly formed Germany, and then you put your finger on the Weimar Republic, and then the National Socialist Third Reich, and then you put it on through the Basic Law of Germany. You put it on Adenauer, the first head of government after World War II, and then you say, okay, let's look at the executive powers that each of the executives had in those 4 different junctures, and it tells you a lot about what's going on in German history. It's a great prism. So all that's to say is we should train our history students in the ways of Aristotle. Is you work through lots of particulars, and then you work toward judgments about what you're seeing, categorizations, distinctions, and so forth.
The couple of years that I had where I was actively coaching teachers on a faculty, I remember going back and forth with a couple folks where I was trying to help them see that the way they were currently setting up their history classes was that they were doing all of that work that you just described. And they were putting together beautiful lectures with great PowerPoints and great illustrations, but they were doing the work instead of the students doing the work. And I love what you just described, because you just described a lot of it's not that the teacher is not doing work. Teachers are always doing work. But the work of the teacher is in planning and arranging all that material, and then asking students to really consciously think through those different pieces. Hopefully any teachers who are listening to this episode will probably go back that was about 7 minutes ago to the beginning of that last question. And by my count, I had at least 5 different lesson plans that you kind of shelled out there for us. Those were great lessons that I could so see being put in place in a variety of different age levels for classes. Andrew, it's so much fun to talk to somebody who knows a lot of history and loves it. What are your favorite eras, countries, or thematic elements to study or to teach when it comes to history?
Yeah, that is a wonderful and a terrible question at the same time. It's because it opens up the door to everything I love and more than I could talk about. But if I had to narrow it down, I'm just crazy about Greek antiquity, and I'm crazy about 20th century Europe. I really enjoy those 2 spheres of study. I was an English major at the University of Notre Dame. I started there in 77, and for my first year, I had declared as an English major. And then my sophomore year, fall semester, sophomore year, I took my first history course that wasn't a survey course. I had a very good survey course in Western civilization with a professor named John Van Engen, who ended up being the director of the Medieval Institute at Notre Dame. He had done his PhD at UCLA and was just a great medievalist. And he gave us an introduction to Western Civ that had a big impact on me. but my imagination was just opened and lit when I took a course in 20th century dictatorships. And there was a professor named Bernard Norling, and he was a bit of a droll man, and you wouldn't expect him to be all that engaging, but he gave the most stunning lectures on 20th century dictatorships. And I'd say about 1/3 of the way into the course, I just woke up and I realized, okay, I have a passion for this that I had not had even for reading fiction. And I realized, I think I would benefit if I was an English major, but I know that I could read fiction for the rest of my life. But this history is so new, it's so fresh and so demanding, and it's so very engaging to me. I'm going to be a history major. I'm going to learn how to think like these historians, and I'm going to learn to tell those stories, and I'm just going to benefit from all the wisdom. I had an extraordinary set of history professors at Notre Dame. They were old school scholars. You didn't know their politics or their religion. They didn't wear them on their sleeves. You might know it if you bumped into them at church on Sunday, but they were dedicated to observation and sympathy. And to a man, they were just exceptional scholars, profoundly good teachers. Some of them ran discussions in class. I had the chance to study with Nathan Hatch, who in the last decade was the chancellor at Wake Forest. He just recently retired maybe a year or so ago. But he was a great scholar of colonial American history and the relationship between religion and American history. And just, he ran really good discussions. I would call them seminar discussions in class. Dr. Norling, however, he just straight up lectured, was just wonderfully interesting. I had another professor named Dr. Bernard, who was a World War II vet. And he was primarily a scholar of the French Revolution. And I took his course on that and loved it. He was also a student of the Pacific Theater, where he had served as a combat officer. And he had a 1-credit course on the Pacific Theater, World War II, the hardest course I ever took. The geography was mercifully difficult. The names of the islands, the names of the Japanese side of the war were very difficult for those of us who were, middle-class Americans to learn, but it was wonderfully rewarding. Anyway, I could go on and list out all my professors, but I just, I fell in love with history because I had such exceptional history professors. And although I went on to graduate studies in theology and politics, I've never stopped studying history and never stopped relating history to almost everything I do.
I think I'd be very curious if your time at Notre Dame overlapped with Brad Berzer at all, because he did his undergrad there, and I suspect y'all are of a similar age. And he would say, I think he would agree with everything you just said about the Notre Dame history faculty when he was there. Is that name familiar? Do you know Dr. Berzer? He's at Hillsdale now.
Oh, yes, I have great admiration for him, but I think he's a young guy compared to me. I think I got for a handful of years.
Maybe so. I definitely read Nathan Hatch's Democratization of American History in undergrad. It was a phenomenal book. It was one of my favorite works of American history. That's fantastic. And as you were describing those two areas of history, Greek antiquity and 20th century dictatorships, you reminded me of Victor Davis Hanson. He's made sort of his own niche out of being able to comment on contemporary politics out of combining those two different areas. I also love that your story is really one of the liberal arts, and the way that going in to study one thing leads to another thing that you did not know you were going to love, that then becomes just completely transformative. It's a never-ending battle to try to convince high school students particularly that they should not specialize too early, because they don't yet know where their education is going to take them and what all there is out there to know. But they think they know, but they don't really know yet.
Yeah. I think that's so true. I actually went to Notre Dame not as my first choice. I was going to go to the local state university, and my dad was a professor there, and he said, well, what do you want to study? And I said, well, I want to study something like history or English, and I'm not sure what I want to do with my life, but I was thinking about being a writer. And he said, okay, well, that's wonderful. And your mom and I support that entirely, but you cannot go to the school where I teach because the school is good on some things. Like my brother went there and studied biology and just had a great education. He said, but you need to go somewhere with a broader humanities training. So I want you to apply to Notre Dame and a couple other places. That's how I ended up at Notre Dame, because I was obedient to my old man.
Oh, there we go. Well, Andrew, I want to go back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. You told us a lot about this idea of studying history to see the whole, and I think our conversations unpacked that a little bit. I want to see if we could expand that to classical education. Do you see classical education as being broadly about the task of seeing all of reality as a whole? And if so, how is that different than other approaches to education that perhaps are less focused on understanding the whole?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's kind of a $25,000 question within the movement. So I've already put my cards on the table that I think the best way to teach is by inductive instruction. And I want to put a lot of particulars, singulars, a lot of examples on the table for the students to study and for them to grow in their experience, their knowledge, their breadth of vision. I'm not really enamored of, especially at the secondary level, I'm not enamored of starting from something like a metaphysical starting point and then sort of having the students sort of glimpse that. I don't think most of them are capable of even glimpsing that. But I think they are, a good Aristotelian form, capable of starting to see the way things are. Like, for example, to understand what it means to be a human, to understand the order of society, to understand our relationship to God by reading and discussing and writing on hundreds of great books, and by studying thousands of years of history. I'll give you one example. You mentioned Victor Davis Hanson, who has such a grasp of Greek antiquity. Often, here's one of the things that he teaches everybody. He draws a distinction between pre-Peloponnesian War democratic citizenship and post-Peloponnesian War democratic citizenship. So American students tend to be kind of uncritical whenever they hear the word democracy. And then when they read Aristotle's Politics and they realize democracy is the best of the bad forms of government. And the bad forms are those where the rulers rule only for their own benefit. The good ones, like monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, those are the rulers who rule for the benefit of everyone. But there was a time, you can call it the golden age of Greece, and when Greek farmers who lived modestly put down their plows, they picked up their shields and their swords, became hoplites, and this little place called Athens defeated the mighty Persian Empire. This was a time of democratic robustness. By the time you get to Socrates, democracy is very corrupt, and a great reason that, not great as in that's evaluatively, but rather a large reason, a significant reason why Socrates was executed is that Athenian democracy had become corrupt, and it became corrupt in no small measure because of the growing corruption that accelerated through the extent of the Peloponnesian War, recounted by Thucydides. So if you could start in the middle with the history of the Peloponnesian War, or you could go back to the Herodotus and the wonderful triumph of the Athenians over the Persian Empire, and then you move forward to the Apology, the Crito, the Phaedo. You look at that history, and it's just a stunning study in human existence, where human existence is measurable by what is truly good, and human behavior is measurable by the choices that they make. And so the pre-Peloponnesian War Democrats, the democratic Athenians, citizens, were not the same as those who put Socrates to death. So that, I think that's another reason why it's so important to study history. That's one way to get around the whole of Greek antiquity. Just like Lincoln and Martin Luther King tried to get their minds around the whole of American history, because there was a crisis in 1776 There was a crisis in 1863. There was a crisis in 1963. And in each case, someone stepped up, looked to the past, and garnered from the past insight into the present, and then moved accordingly. And in each subsequent story becomes a story for us that informs how we are to live as well. So I think I moved in several different directions there, but each one was intended to help us understand what it means to see the whole. And I don't mean by the way, I don't mean seeing the whole, like history's not over. So we don't really speak of the meaning of history. We speak of meaning in history. We don't speak of the whole of history as in every event, because not every event has happened. The future is yet to arrive. But it is the case that although the past doesn't exist anymore and the present is gone as soon as you snap your finger, it slips into the past, and the future hasn't yet arrived. It is interesting that time is what it is. It's a mystery, and history has a great force on us. It really draws us. But it also draws us in a way where we have to think hard. We have to make good, important judgments. Augustine says the memory is where we collect what we know and love. And that means what we remember has to be informed by the most important things in us. That is our wisdom and our deepest loves, our love for one another, our love for God, our love for the past, our love for the future.
Several years ago, I read a book that had a phrase that stuck with me about the nature of things. The author was a guy named Marion Montgomery, went by the nickname the Hillbilly Thomist.
Yeah.
And his phrase, "the nature of things," stuck with me as one of the things that I think all of the best forms of education are trying to help students perceive. And to a greater or lesser extent, students finish a course of education hopefully better able to perceive the nature of things. I heard you speaking about the whole and saw something kind of similar in that like maybe we can see the whole, maybe we only catch a glimpse, but we perceive more of it, and we become better for the seeking of the whole rather than trying to focus very narrowly on this niche. But then we gain the niche, but at the cost of being able to see the whole. And it seems to me that's part of what the whole classical education project is trying to do, is trying to recover this sense of there is a wholeness to reality, and that it belongs to us as rational beings, perhaps maybe not ever to finish finding the whole, but certainly to seek it and to try to understand the mysteries that God has hidden within creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I think that's very much true. I have a lot of confidence that if students look at the past and its pastness, they look at history observationally and sympathetically, that even singular events will illuminate their humanity. And if we stick kind of rigidly with Platonic forms, there's a sense in which something beautiful or something just never really fulfills what justice and beauty consist in. But if we follow Aristotle, then, something beautiful is truly beautiful, and something just, the moving target in Aristotle's ethics and politics is justice, and the measure of justice is the good man, and that, to my eye, speaks very powerfully to those of us who study history and find it of great insight, that history is the field of action of the good man, and what we want our students is to find that good man, find that good woman, find that people who live according to the order of things, like the pre-Peloponnesian Athenian Democrats and the Socrates who never left his city except to defend her on the battlefield and was willing to die for her, to obey the laws, and to die in a way that would be good for his friends. That is, even in the last minutes, he's talking with his friends. These, I think, are all very powerful moments for young people to look at and say, yeah, each one of those is inherently really insightful and truly good, and the kind of thing that one could measure one's own life by. The same with, Lincoln, when he looked at the field where all the soldiers had died at Gettysburg. He said, it's not that we can make this place sacred. Their blood made it sacred. And so he didn't, in a sense, he didn't lay claim to the whole of things. He's humbly said, no. There are those who've gone on before us who have given us life and have shown us what it means to be dedicated to what is true and to what is noble. All those examples, I think, are terribly powerful. And as teachers of history, I think we need to do everything we can to make those stories really pop, really be powerful for our students, and so that they can see, as you just described it, to see the whole of things, to glimpse the whole of things by seeing the integrity and the power of those individual events.
That phrase, history is the field of action of the good man. That's a great phrase. Well, Andrew, as we wrap up, I'm intrigued by the titles of your two current books that you've written, History, Forgotten and Remembered, and then The Life We Have Together, A Case for Humane Studies, A Vision for Renewal. Do you have current books in your writing pipeline? What's next for you as far as writing books goes?
I don't have a book right now, but I am writing every day, and I'm writing scripts. So we have taken on a 3-year initiative on July 4th, 2026. America will celebrate its 250th anniversary. Kane Academy is launching a series of short films. We call the project History 250. And we are creating, we're telling America's story one film at a time. And they're going to be short, beautiful films. Think of Ken Burns' The Civil War series meets Christopher Flannery's beautiful American story podcasts. We're going to tell these stories in beautiful ways. There'll be no cartoons. There is a major purveyor of short films on American history that uses cartoons. We're not going to condescend to all the classical education students with cartoons. We're going to give them the kinds of things historians give us: photographs, maps, portraiture, things like that, really great images. And we're going to tell the stories observationally and sympathetically. So we're not going to hide from the Trail of Tears, American slavery, the internment of the Japanese during World War II. We're not going to hide from these things, but we're also not going to reduce the American past to our failures. We're going to measure them by what is enduring and true and good, as we find in the American founding, the speeches of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr., the heroism of everyone, the whole country, threw its towel in to win World War II. I mean, people at home saving, scraping, rubber, glass, tin foil, things like that, and then sending their sons off to war. This summer, my family and I were in New Orleans, and we went to the wonderful World War II Museum. I recommend it to all your listeners, all your viewers. It's one of the best museums in America. There's early on in the museum, you see a plaque with a quotation from General Eisenhower. And during the war, he wrote his son, John, and he said, "I am convinced that this is a paraphrase. I'm convinced that this war, if it's anything, is a war between those who are defending liberty and those who would take liberty from the rest of us." And, no philosopher Eisenhower was, but I think he nailed it. I think he got it right. And the war is not something like a complete, perfect performance of the Allies, militarily, morally, politically. But in the aggregate, it's a story that is about the struggle for civilization and for the kind of liberal thinking and the spiritual interior freedom that mark the best of the West and measure whatever failings we fall into. So anyway, those are all kind of attitudes and images that we're going to utilize in our series. History 250, we're going to start rolling out films in the next few weeks, actually.
Oh, that's great to know. I know certainly I'm always interested in really high quality materials, especially without giving in to some of the poor content that has been produced, or some of the poor mediums for that. But if we could have high quality, historically faithful videos that would communicate really easily to the rising generation, I think that would be a huge gift to schools in particular. That
they're going to be free. And they're and we're going to have so there'll be probably something around 250 short films. There'll be a bank of maps a bank of writings, do a deeper dive, especially for the teachers, and other resources that we're going to throw into the mix. So it'll be kind of a one-stop shop, and not in the sense of buying anything, but a one-stop library of resources on American history. You'll be able to access it. You'll be able to get to it by way of the Cana Academy website, but we've created a new website that's not live yet, and it'll be www.history250.org. But right now, anybody going to the Cana Academy site will see it as one of the main buttons on our landing page.
Well, that's fantastic. Do you have grand plans of continuing the series to kind of go beyond American history, or do you see it confined just to American history?
We want to go beyond American history. So we want to do church history. We want to do some specialized histories like the history of film, things like that. So but we're not announcing that yet. So
Sure.
I may have let the cat out of the bag, but we'd like to do more, but we'll be so grateful to get this one done.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But anyway, that's what I'm writing these days. I'm writing scripts, and it's a different genre for me. So in the past, I've written poetry. I've written, expository stuff, lots of blog posts. I've written a couple of books. But this is the first time I was a drama teacher, and I wrote dozens of plays that were adaptations of classical works of literature. But this is a different, this is a hybrid thing, a script for a short movie trying to tell, in around 5 minutes, the salient points of a major event. It's tough. It's a big discipline. It's very creative, but it's terribly rewarding.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I will be excited to see when that website goes live, and can't wait to check out some of those projects. Well, Andrew, you've already mentioned it, but I want to close with definitely an opportunity for you to highlight the websites one more time. Just in case anybody is listening and thinking, how can I support the work of the History 250 Project or Cana Academy? Where can people find and follow your work online? Where can they find out more about Cana Academy?
Yeah, check us out at www.canaacademy, Cana is CANA.org. And we have hundreds of free resources for you. And we also have lots of discounts if you end up buying even a few of our guides. Look for seasonal discounts. We just finished up a President's Day sale, and I'm sure we'll be having more sales yet this spring semester.
Fantastic. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a delightful conversation.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.
Well, thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Andrew Zwerneman, president of Cana Academy, and as hopefully this conversation has demonstrated, a master teacher dedicated to preparing the next generation of teachers. If you like this episode, please do leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the truth, and love the beautiful.